Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ventures. I'm excited about today's episode with David Pierce. We take some time not only getting to know him as a technical professional and a product manager, but we spend time talking about what is a technical product manager. And in previous episodes, we've dove into the necessity of having a product manager as part of your startup and the importance of why having somebody who deeply understands business objectives and customer insights and empathizes with the users and customers of your product is critically important, and how most CEOs who think they're good at product usually aren't. And so interacting with people who are world-class at this trade is critical for the process of building a company. So David, I've known for a long time. He is full of insight and wisdom, and so we take some extended time to kind of hear his journey and hear his progression into navigating different management roles and technical roles and engineering roles. He's a software engineer. He's a great manager. He's carved out a role in Moz, which we talk about that company in technical product management. And so there are a number of insights here for those companies of various sizes, and especially for founders that are growing companies. So if you're watching this show, you can also listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can just search for Ventures. And if you're listening, you can also watch by visiting wclittle.com, and there you'll see more extensive show notes to the things that we talk about today. So with that, please enjoy this conversation with David Pierce. All right, David, welcome to the show.
Hey, Will, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'm excited for this conversation. I've admired the way that your career has progressed and the technical acumen that you have and the empathy for the people who use your products and interact with what you build. So would you mind just kicking us off by telling us a little bit about your background and what you're up to these days?
Yeah, sure. So my name's David Pierce. Today, I'm working as a technical product manager at a company called Moz, and we'll unpack a little bit what all those things mean. I've been in Seattle now for a little over 10 years. I moved out here from Nebraska, of all places. And, I can tell a little bit of my story of how I got here and how I ended up at Moz. But yeah, I came out here from Nebraska, the first big city I'd ever lived in. Had all those fun stories of just encountering big city and figuring out my place in it, figuring out my place in community, and figuring out what all of that meant with respect to my career. And as the story goes, I ended up meeting a girl and starting a family. And so Seattle and Washington State's definitely my home. I like the way the Pacific Northwest, the way that people think here. I really got introduced to the startup community and the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed that sets founders from up here apart, it's just the empathy and the way that they care about people and the problems that they think are interesting and the passion that they bring those problems, which are all elements that you'll find in West Coast or Midwest entrepreneurs. But that's just something I really like about working in the Pacific Northwest, all of its quirks aside. So let's talk about my career. Like I mentioned, I started in 2009 or so. I graduated from school. I had this management and information systems degree with a computer science minor, and I got an opportunity to work for a Redmond area software company. And so I started there as a program manager. And one of the things that I've learned over the course of the career is that you have to spend a lot of time figuring out any given thing might have like 5 different names. And so, when you look at someone and say, oh, I'm a PM, it's like you could be a program manager at Microsoft, and that means something. You could be a project manager, and that means a completely different thing. Or you could be a product manager who's got different goals and different responsibilities. And then, at my current company, I've introduced this notion of technical product manager and trying to disambiguate what that new role might mean within a team of existing product managers. So yeah, I started as a program manager. My responsibility back then was identify specs for requirements and work with a test and a development team and build things, right? Up until all that point, all my internships had been at very large companies, enterprises, large corporations. I got to work at a bank, which was pretty neat. So I got to learn how big businesses work and watch how those muscles that they develop for, for discipline and scale, and also very responsible change management when the impact could be, one small mistake can get really big. But after that first job, I found myself starting over and really thinking about, like, man, what do I like about software? What do I like about helping people? What do I want out of my career? Um, you know, Working for months on a little widget that will impact a lot of people, but in a small thing, I didn't find a lot of passion in that.
Mm.
So instead, I ended up diving into the small business and startup ecosystem in Seattle, and I think that really changed and influenced my career a long ways. That was also a big inflection point. I wanted to shift toward being a software engineer, and it took me about a year or two to get my first full time software engineer role. And that was fun. I was sitting in park benches in Leshai waiting for my wife to pick me up after work, reading about Node.js. And meanwhile I was banging on like .NET and C# projects, but like, there's this whole world of open source that I wasn't experiencing. And, Node was new back then, and there was not as many online resources. And so, yeah, just reading on a park bench is how I learned how to do all that stuff. But yeah, I was working at a wine website auction company, and I really loved it. I really like wine and getting to learn that. And that was a cool company. It was older. It was more established. It was small, but it wasn't a startup in the sense that it wasn't. It wasn't an idea in search of a repeatable business model. It had a repeatable business model. It was sustainable, but it was not seeking growth anymore. So that wasn't really a growth stage company. It was just they found something, and the small pool of investors that they had, it was working for the board. It was working for the company. That was fine. About 50 people. One of the coolest jobs or projects that I had there, though, was the CTO said, "Hey, you and the photographer are going to fly down to Napa and go hang out in the warehouse and just spend a few days there and just soak it in, interview everyone, talk to the warehouse people, talk to the sales team, just go absorb what they do and look for problems, look for things we can do to help them, look for things we can build the business." And without realizing it, my CTO at the time was coaching me into what I would later learn to be product management.
Mm.
And as a software engineer at a big company, I never would have been asked to go spend time and go find out what's wrong with this customer's problem, go find out why they're not doing something that way. They weren't really asking me to be curious or to ask questions. I was learning how to bang out software quickly and at scale. So yeah, I got to fly down to Napa, followed the warehouse people around, took my notes, went back up to Seattle, and then my job was to pitch to the CTO and the CEO, here are the top 3 projects I think we could do to make life better in the warehouse. I recommend this one. What do you all think? And I got that project approved, built the thing, flew it back down to Napa. This was it was not web software. It was actually like meant to be deployed on a laptop. The problem I was solving there was their wine inventory process. So somebody in the warehouse would go and pull a bottle from a rack, scan it, make sure it was where it was supposed to be, and do that on a periodic basis. And it would take a week, something like that. And so I built them this no-look scanning tool that was integrated against our inventory system and could just take that, and one person could do it all in an hour. And that was a great experience of going from soup to nuts, as they say.
Yeah.
Really going and looking for a problem, defining and shaping that problem, and then also helping the business understand what outcomes would emerge if we solved that problem. And then because I was a software engineer, I could recommend how we would solve that. So that was like my first taste, right? As a software engineer, I'd spent a lot of years building up having the answer to how something should be done. I learned, I can help my boss out a lot by giving them a menu of options. And when I'm coaching software engineers now, it's usually what I'm telling them is, give us a menu of ways to get this done. You own the how of the problem space. But what I was getting to learn was what we should do, for whom, and why. And ever since that experience, I've been just really captivated by that. So then after that, I moved to Startup Weekend, which is maybe an organization that I think your listeners and our mutual pool of community folks would have heard of before. But the mission there was, we love entrepreneurship. We think more people should have access to it. One means by which, or the how, is these Friday to Sunday startup events where people learn how to pitch, how to do an elevator pitch, how to form a team. You just get your first taste of entrepreneurship there, and well-seasoned entrepreneurs would show up and try to build a business. Folks that were maybe stuck in a corporate job and didn't want to stay there, or folks that wanted a career shift and didn't know how to get out, they could come in and experience all that too. So it was a great learning experience. I ended up becoming the technical director there. And that was fun, learning how to grow a team, learning how to go from a team of 20 people to, I think, almost 80 or 100. Um, Startup Weekend now is now part of Techstars. So, I mean, that's having grown since I moved on. But again, that too was a good experience because I learned how to grow a team, learned how to be part of growing a business and identifying, there's business needs, but organizational needs, people needs. Like, how do we put this team together? How do we be self-aware about the skills that we have, but also the skills that we're lacking? And then what are the right ways to fill those skills, right? And so if you're at a growing business, sometimes the answer is, well, we'll pay a premium for short-term help, but that's where you think about tech debt and leverage it might pay off in the long run to incur some debt now to go faster than we would have otherwise, and we have a plan to pay that off later. But sometimes it makes more sense to kind of go faster, but pay the premium and pay it back later. And then sometimes it makes more sense to be a lot more strategic about how you want to grow your team. Like, we need this role. We want to understand these skills, and we want these skills to be a core competency. So we want to introduce someone into the community of our business that can do that for us, right? Or grow up from within, which is a third option that you can find. So that was a really good experience about Startup Weekend. But the other thing that I learned from working there was we didn't have product managers. We had community managers. We had folks whose job it was to understand what it is that we're hearing from our volunteers and our organizers. We also had our executive team, which had a CEO, no CTO at the time. So and then call it a VP of product. And kind of among the three of us, we would have to kind of calculate what is our vision for our strategy, and which ways would our technical investments help enable that strategy, and in which ways would we need to be clear, like, this isn't a core competency for Startup Weekend. I would say one thing that I see a lot of engineers and a lot of early teams make is not identify what is not a core competency and try to build everything from scratch. And software engineers love to do that because software engineers like to make software. But the number of times that I've been at companies trying to dig ourselves out from the burden of this custom software that isn't actually part of our business, that if you're at a company that you're experiencing that now, that's not unique to you. I've been at so many different teams and companies that I've been a part of. That happens all the time. So a big part of technical and product leadership is identifying what your core competencies are, and then identifying what you want to do with the things that are not. So anyway, like I mentioned, there was no explicit product leadership there. And after I left Startup Weekend and looked back on my time there, I kind of realized I was a technical director, but without realizing it, I was doing the work of product management and articulating who the customer was and what problem they had and why the thing that we would build could help that problem. So again, articulating who and why and what, and then working with my dev team to say how that could be done. And because it was a small group, I got to spend a little bit of time with architecture and building and coding the thing as well. And at small companies, you get to do that kind of thing. You get to wear all hats, which is what a lot of people at a startup would experience, right? And when it's small, it's okay. Like, those lines are blurry, but you are still small enough that you are leveraging kind of the intimacy of the relationships, the complexities of the organizational relationships. I mean, the way that they grow exponentially. Like, by the time you get to 100 or 150 people, you don't have, oh, I know who works on that, or I know who's good at that. You tend to start relying on org charts and like explicit labels and titles.
Mm-hmm.
And so you may find yourself in an organization where it's growing and you are used to kind of working in a breadth, not depth fashion. And you're starting to realize the world is getting a little bit less fuzzy at my company. And because of that, I'm maybe falling through cracks that I didn't realize were there, because there isn't an explicit name for being a jack of all trades, if you will.
Mm.
So so then I ended up at a company called Moz, and so I think at this point it's useful to pause and talk about what Moz is and what Moz does. In some respects, Moz behaves and thinks like a startup. Moz is a Seattle-based company. It started, is it 15, 20 years ago? And I've been there about 5 years. It's going to be 6 soon. So I came in when it was still under 200 people, maybe close to 150. And I came in as a software engineer again. At that time, I remember telling my new manager, "It's like, hey, I just got done with people management. I just got done with all the strategy stuff. I want to get back to being a software engineer and get good at coding again."
Mm-hmm.
So I remember telling him, "I was like, give me a year before you ask me to do any leadership. I just want to code for a bit." And then that eventually did evolve. But let's see. So Moz works on what we would call SEO, search engine optimization, if you haven't heard that before. And if you haven't heard that before, really the easiest way to talk about search engine optimization, usually I'll tell folks who, if they don't have any marketing background, I'll usually kind of help them. It's like, imagine you're at a company and you want people to find your product. You want to find out, you have an idea of where they are, you have an idea of what they're looking for. Like, let's think about how billboards work, right? You would throw up a billboard on the side of a road where you think your customers might drive down, and people are seeing it. They might make a decision based on that, but like, a billboard is a very blunt force object way to get attention to people who might be looking for you. The next thing you might look at is like, okay, well, I know most of my shoppers work around here. I got like park benches or bus ads. You start looking into advertising, which is a little bit more targeted. You have a little bit more science behind where are the people I'm trying to reach, what do they care about, and how do I find that intersection and reach them, right? And then there's this tool that comes along called the World Wide Web, right? And we know a lot of people are using it. And because the web is so big, people are finding, and historically had found different ways to get along, and I remember it was thinking back to like when things like Lycos and what was the search engine with the dog? Can't remember the name now. Alta Vista used to be a thing. Like, Google did not start as like the dominant and almost only option in search engines, right? These tools started to emerge to help people find things on the web because it was getting so big. And from there, people started learning is like, well, people are using these search engine tools. Google figured out I can throw ads on this experience. I can throw ads on this search product. So if we make our search product really, really good, more people will use it and we can show them ads. And so search engine optimization emerged as people saying, well, the web, the search engine, is a lot more effective than a billboard is. How can we use that to reach people? How can we use that to meet people when they are searching for a thing, right? And so the difference that you'll find in SEO versus ads, we call this organic traffic. So if you are using something like Google Analytics and you open up your browser and you're trying to figure out how are people finding my website, how are people finding my content, you'll find one section of Google Analytics will tell you direct traffic, where it's like they just knew your URL and went straight to it. And you'll find referral traffic, which is somebody thought my content was good enough to link to it from their website, or somebody put a link to my page on Twitter. That's called a referral. And then the last one is just organic, where they use a search engine to find your content. And the search engine thought that your content was good enough and was a most likely good answer for whatever the query was. And they rank you, and maybe you get traffic that way, right? So Moz's mission is we want to make SEO easy and accessible for everyone. We want to help people be found by the people who are looking to find them. I started my career there at Moz working on what was called local search. So, I was going to say, when was the last time you went to look for a restaurant? That's harder to do right now. We're not doing that as much in the last year, but that's coming back. And someday you'll want to say like, hey, I was just up in your neck of the woods recently, right? It's like if I wanted to go find a restaurant in Roslyn, or if I wanted to find breweries near me, or a place to go get coffee. That's what we call local search, where the most relevant results are businesses that you could drive to or order from, as opposed to something like e-commerce where it's all done online. So anyway, that's search engine optimization is what changes would you make to your website, the technical structure of it, the technical composition, the content, the way that you organize all the pages and link thereof, um, the links that you're encouraging people to make to your website. All of those behaviors and activity we call SEO, because we believe Google doesn't, and other search engines don't explicitly tell us what they think is important about a website. But there are signals that they seem to pick up on, some more heavily than others. And so if you can influence those signals on your website, we call that SEO. So anyway, I started there as a software engineer. And like I mentioned, I was working on that local search project. And that was a product within a family of products at Moz. And one of the things that attracted me so much when I talked to my recruiter, who brought me into Moz, she described it as, hey, there's a startup within a startup who's trying to grow their team and to grow their product. They recently rebranded and did a lot of things and reshaped the UI, and now they're interested in growing, and we need a team to do that. And because of my history with the startup community and because of my relationship through Startup Weekend and a lot of the different investment firms and legal firms that just help out the Seattle community here, because of those connections, I was able to get connected to Moz and came in. And that just sounded so appealing, is to get to work on software at a startup. My second son had just been born, so the stability of working at a bigger, I said bigger, I mean, I went from 80 people to 150 people. That felt like stability to me.
Right.
And so yeah, that was all attractive, was getting to be a software engineer there. Eventually through, as is the course of a lot of big businesses, a lot of leadership left over time. So our product leadership was kind of gone, and it was just engineers running this local product. And that didn't feel satisfying. I think, if you're at a startup as a software engineer, you should want to know that the code that you're writing is impacting people. You should want to know that the software that you're writing is changing things and helping folks and meeting business goals. Or you don't, and you just write the code, that's fine. But I figure most hires at a small startup, like you kind of want to look for people who care about those things and who have an eye and like kind of are watching your back from the code side. And so, anyway, that's what I always looked for when I was hiring engineers at startups. But that was a feeling I had, was like, I'm seeing my product not grow. I'm seeing opportunities not met. I'm seeing us not move into new segments. And so because of that, I started asking more interesting questions, like, why are these kinds of users using these features, but not those features? Why isn't this feature getting any traction? What's perhaps leading people to it or not? And because of the SEO background, great, like, what are other people finding when they look for terms related to ours? What are the terms related to our business? And that's a little bit thinking more like a marketer, but one of the things that I've learned about growing into product management is getting very good at asking interesting questions and having a curiosity and bringing that curiosity to the product. But I was doing it from the perspective of a software engineer. And so a lot of what I was doing at the time was working on something. I'd code up a bit of a prototype, put some bunch of slides together and say, great, who do I pitch this to now? How do I figure out who needs to know what's going on, what the opportunity is, and the fact that, like, as an engineer, I could see an opportunity that they didn't have eyes to see yet. And how can I make someone get excited about this opportunity and then greenlight it and build it and ship it and win, right? I mean, I guess that was naive. I was starting out. So, so it was kind of a series of doing that over and over and over again, of slowly kind of partnering with and assisting the product managers and giving them good questions to ask and giving them data to answer their questions, of giving them insights that I and the rest of the developers could see, or giving them insights from looking at the data and the databases that we're playing with. Our product managers aren't necessarily dabbling or playing in those spaces, and our software engineers are. So there was a gap and there's a chasm. I like to think a lot about, you ever see those fun inspirational videos where they have a colorblind person and they give them those glasses that help them see color? I don't know how. It's very cool magic, but people can see color. And that's kind of how I try to think about data and technical acumen is that if I can teach a product manager to see all of a sudden, now there's new colors they can paint with that they didn't know were there.
Mm.
And that is super impactful. And I think that's a huge impact that software engineers can have when they learn some customer empathy, when they learn how to think, how the business side of the house thinks, right? But I'm still describing this world where you've got product managers here and software engineers over here. And depending on what meetings you have, sometimes they talk. There's a gap, there's a chasm. So I guess what I'm talking about now is what technical product management is and how that emerged for me as a way to stand in that gap and to make it more formally my job to ask those interesting questions, to learn more about our customers and to advocate for them, but in a different way from the rest of our technical product managers, leverage my software engineering background to see colors that we couldn't see before, to ask questions that we didn't know we should ask. But also a third place where I help out is there's a very common problem that you'll have sometimes when ideas come from the software side of the house. You can find yourself having minted a new hammer looking for nails to hit, right? And you'll see nails that weren't really there, or you'll look at a screw and say, that looks enough like a nail. I'm going to try to sell this hammer to that, that kind of thing. The analogy's breaking down. But so that's a third place where I help a whole lot is how to make sure our teams are not producing hammers that don't have targets, that don't have, a customer with a problem there. So that's how, I guess another way is like I help manage emerging capabilities and technologies. So anyway, technical product manager. I think the rest of this conversation, we're just going to unpack a little bit more of what that is. But yeah, where do you want to go from that?
So lots to that. I have a million questions. There is a meta theme arising in this conversation and in previous episodes of this podcast around team composition, roles and responsibilities in a growing startup. Mm-hmm. Having the privilege in my day job to work with many different startups as they're going from pre-seed to seed extension, Series A, kind of that idea all the way to Series A is the world that I live in.
Yeah.
How teams compose themselves and think carefully about how to segment those roles and responsibilities is, I'm now appreciating just how important, how difficult, how important, how much of an art and a science that is. And so as we talk about product management, technical project management, I have a bunch of questions there. But before we go there, I'd love to actually just maybe rewind a little bit. What was it in your early career that even prompted, like, what did you study in school? Mm-hmm. What were you interested in as a kid? And then what led to ultimately getting those internships and program management with the larger companies?
Yeah, sure. Let's start with what I did with as a kid rather. So I grew up in a military family. So my father served in the United States Navy for over 20 years. So that meant we got to live in a lot of places. I got to live in Spain and Italy, lived in Panama. And my mother, so the reason I'm David and not David is my mother is Colombian. And so when we lived in Panama, it was very easy to go visit family. It was easier rather to go visit family in Colombia. As a kid, I just got to meet so many different people. And then I came back to the United States at around 10 years old, went from Italy to Kansas, if you can imagine what that felt like, right? So, and what was cool about that though is, the thing that left me with is there's so many people and they're all different and all of them find some way to be happy. All of them share in this human experience of, we've got problems and we band together and we solve them. We solve them in different ways. And yet, that's the thing that sometimes I'll talk with my wife about, like when we'll drive through parts of South Seattle or outside of Seattle. And I love just driving around and looking at parts that are completely different than West Seattle and just being like, all those people are finding ways to be happy. Like they've got their life and they're content. And the controlling factor isn't where they live, not always, right? And so I really did develop a big appreciation, I think, just for the diversity of experience, the diversity of culture, and just realizing like all those people can find, we can find ways to help them, right? And that's a second big aspect of my upbringing is being in a military family and also being raised by a Colombian mother. Service was a huge, big part of my upbringing, and my mom. I always joke that sometimes my mom would see she'd see a problem, was like, I can help you with that. Boys, come here. And then she put my brother and me to work, right? So, which I loved that. But that attitude is like, hey, we're here to help. We're here to serve. And like, that's a big part of being part of my family. My dad's a very smart guy. He works in intelligence, naval intelligence. And so he spends a lot of time thinking about systems and how things work. And a lot of that rubbed off on me. And I remember being a kid, like just taking apart toys and just trying to figure out like how does this motor work and um, how do the wheels on my remote control car know how to turn. I remember my dad, very vivid memory. My dad bought me like a little crystal radio kit where I had to like wrap wire around the plumbing out of the sink and could turn that in a radio. I was like, I didn't know how this stuff worked. I didn't really grow up with too much of a programming or computers experience. My dad did. We had a little Texas Instruments thing that is like just the keyboard all in the unit, and you can plug it in the TV. And he built me a lunar lander game. I had no idea what was going on. All I knew is my dad punched a bunch of things on the keyboard, and I could put in different numbers, and the spaceship might crash. So my dad wasn't a programmer, but he grew up in an age where people were learning a little bit more about that. We had the old little family computer. I don't remember what it was at the time, but like I somehow managed to destroy it from the software side. So I let's see, I grew up in an age kind of in between where I do still remember, VCRs and having to show up at a specific time in a specific place, or else like you wouldn't meet. Um, and I think it was in college when search engines and the internet and Wikipedia were starting to become commonplace. So I got to live a really cool transitional part of seeing both. Um, None of that directly translated into why I ended up in software, though. I thought I was going to become a naval aviator or fly airplanes, kind of like Top Gun. It was one of my favorite movies.
Oh, cool.
And then I realized that I throw up way too easy, like from carnival rides and stuff. So I was like, okay, maybe not that. Maybe the next thing might be intelligence like my father, or maybe engineering, because I loved figuring out how things worked. And I loved knowing that I could stare at a thing and think about it and think about how its parts work together, and like things can be understood. And I think that's what I love about software. And this is why I want younger software engineers or even students, when I'm investing in mentoring with younger people, whether they want to go to software or not, demystifying this idea that this app on your phone, it can be it can be understood. I want to demystify the notion that like it's just appeared, and there's like a gulf divide between you and being a part of making that software, making those experiences. And that learning that computers and systems and mechanics they're just unfathomably dumb, and they follow simple rules. Physics and electronics they all follow very simple rules, and those rules are composed by humans to create really amazing things, and to create really amazing things that can transform people's lives. And so my path into software was thinking I was going to go into engineering because I liked math. I liked understanding how things work and applying that understanding to solve problems. And I remember my dad brought me to the University of Nebraska. I thought we were going to go watch a football game, and instead we took a detour into this room. It's called the Rake School at the University of Nebraska, and it was this idea of an integrated applied education. So it was part of the honors program, and I took my accounting classes and my software engineering courses all kind of in the same area with the same 30 kids about. And my accounting teachers were talking to my software engineering teachers. And so I would learn something about credits and debits, and then I'd go have to implement that as I was learning about stacks and queues in software engineering, and apply the concept that I just learned in accounting back into that. And that was just this really powerful concept of the integrated applied education. But more than that, though, they were just teaching us to think about problems and how to solve them and how to be leaders and stepping forward in that. Super competitive, a lot of fun, not something you'd expect at a university in Nebraska, but that still persists to this day. And I think it had a huge impact on who I am now as far as my career. So I ended up being a management major. My big idea at the time was I want to sit in between tech and um, and business.
Hmm.
And I still remember my freshman year. It was an intro to Java course, and I can empathize with the folks that are like looking at their first programming assignments and thinking, I can't do this, right? Because I showed up and my only programming experience was trying to figure out how the games on my graphing calculator worked. And I remember I had to sit outside of rooms and sit outside of the TA's office and stay up really late trying to figure out how to get my programs to work. I still remember one of my worst bugs in a homework assignment is because I didn't know what static meant. On like a class, you can have static properties. I guess in Ruby, I think they might be called class properties or something like that. I didn't know what static meant. I just knew, figured you had to sprinkle it in your program to make things work. I didn't know what it meant, and so I just used it. And finally, it was my roommate was a CS major, and he's like, "Oh, that thing." I didn't know why that was so important, but I stuck with it, and I learned, and it was a big part of my career. And I did emerge with a CS minor, never intending for my career to be explicitly about software development. It was meant to be about working with teams and solving problems and identifying what the problem is to solve. So that's kid through college, and my newly minted degree. I ended up flying out to Seattle to start my software career that way. Yeah. Along the way, as the internships I were picking, a lot of my internships I picked because they looked competitive and I thought they would look good on a resume. And a lot of students, I think, even back then, the idea of building a competitive looking or impressive looking resume, it's still a challenge today, and folks are looking for more creative ways to do it. In the Midwest, when I was graduating, entrepreneurship and working at a startup whose name you maybe never heard of was not advertised as a way to emerge from college with a lot of paths to success, right? It is risky. There's a lot of businesses in the Midwest that are risk averse. There's not a clear path to success. It's not well known. Every time I change jobs, my mom doesn't understand why I'm leaving a good job to go do a new job. And I was like, well, it's just different now. Like, there's no pension in store for me, and this is kind of how we move and circulate talent in Seattle. So, the internships I were picking were just mostly to try to chase corporate goals, and they were really shaped and designed at the time to propel me into a corporate career path. I did have a cool internships where I started volunteering at a homeless shelter, just take out trash. I was like a 20, 21-year-old kid, and I was like, I can help. And for a long time, I think the project they had me on was cataloging in-kind receipts and just like writing things down. And I was just looking at them like, this process is slow. Do you want it to be faster? He was like, well, what do you mean? It was like, I think we could make this better. Let me tell you about software and websites. And so I eventually ended up growing to become their web specialist, I think was the title. But yeah, eventually they told me they figured out, like, hey, have you heard of AmeriCorps? We can pay you to do this stuff. I'm like, hey, that sounds great. So that was my first job just before graduating, was being the web specialist at a homeless shelter. And again, it wasn't a tech company. It wasn't a software company. It was a very direct and palpable mission to serve the people in Lincoln, Nebraska that needed that kind of help. And me looking for opportunities to either carry the marketing message in special ways, or to carry the marketing message to fundraising, or look for ways to automate things at software, right? Because what we didn't want was for the limited staff resources at the homeless shelter to be spending their time on rote mundane tasks that a computer could do, and that a computer is very good at doing, and freeing up their time to go do human things and leaving the other tasks to computers. So yeah, that's kind of my pre official career arc, was just doing things like that.
Yeah. So in previous episodes, we've talked a lot about the necessity for product management, for people who understand the business objectives, who are going to understand the market, are going to deeply empathize with the people who are going to be using this product, and are going to be drawing up a set of requirements or specifications that this product should probably have. We've dove into the growth aspects of product and growth, where it's maybe the equivalent of a growth product manager. We've also talked about marketing operations and the analytics and data flow around all of that. But you're right, there's not a lot of conversation about the role of technical product manager. So let's maybe dive into this a little bit. Why is the technical product manager, one, a thing? Two, why is having the, like you said, to bring color to the product management experience? Why is that even necessary? Because you can imagine a naysayer saying like, well, it just kind of gets in the way. So
Yeah.
how would you describe the reason for needing the technical project manager role?
Yeah, there's a few ones that were very clear at Moz that I suspect a lot of other organizations would have as well. And I'll here's the bullet list, and then we'll unpack them. Innovation, so rapid innovation and prototyping. That's one need. The second one would be highly technical or proprietary metrics products where we don't emerging technologies and capabilities, right? And having a skill set to manage emerging capabilities and technologies. That's a second need. A third need then is when we have highly technical products, you might need a specialized business skill set to understand the place and the opportunity and the challenges that come with those highly technical products. So let's look at the first one, just rapid innovation and prototyping. That's super fun for me. It's one of my favorite things is getting a small group of engineers and designers and making it a highly integrated team where the walls fall down all of a sudden. And it's where you can start to develop your capability for entrepreneurship, with an I. It's also a place where you can start saying like, how can we like rapidly start building this culture without having to boil the ocean of doing the really rapid build, test, learn loop. Right? And so that was an aspect that I understand the language of our software engineers pretty well. I understand how do I put it? I know the cheap, better, best life cycle, right? Whereas if you aren't as familiar with what can be produced out of your software team or what options there are, if the software team tells you like, we'll build this thing and it'll take us 3 weeks and it'll do this kind of thing, it's like, well, actually I only need a quarter of that right now. And give me maybe a smaller version that can do these things. These things can come later. And one really good example of that was an alpha that I was running at Moz, and we wanted to rapidly onboard people who would have a lot of data in bulk. And so I had on the roadmap CSV import. And what I failed to do at the time was articulate my goals and my non-goals, and to articulate them in a way and to anticipate what a software engineer might perceive, right? And I find goals and non-goals, in addition to acceptance criteria, but non-goals are a really useful tool to say, this is what I don't want right now. What ended up happening was, our engineers say, oh, well, I want to make a CSV import. I want to make it great. And so the sprint rolls past and it's not done. I'm like, okay, fine. We'll wait another, like halfway through into the next sprint. I'm like, why don't I still have a CSV import? Like, well, we're stuck working on this validation thing. We're also trying to work on this thing where it will report back to you the rows that failed and why they failed. And then they can live edit them before they can try again. I was like, that all sounds wonderful for a product that doesn't exist right now. Right. Like that all sounds wonderful, but what I need is to be able to onboard these alpha testers. So give me the crappiest CSV import that you can give me. And like, even if it barely works, like I can do it on the tester's behalf. I can log in as them and just use the crappy CSV import. And because I have a software background, like I'm not going to get tripped up by the barely functioning software. We can proceed on our learning goals while we're making the prettier version of this, right? So I think a product manager without a tech background could do this, but I'm intimately familiar with the software engineering process, and I know how to ask for the parts and the pieces of iteration, but I can also tolerate, how do I put it, like the software before they put a coat of paint on it. So those are the places I can step into things very early phase. The second thing I talked about was managing emerging capabilities and technologies. So Moz, we deal with a lot of data. So, I've described SEO and how we help people optimize. So like the way that we can make those recommendations. we sit on a lot of data. We sit on a lot of machine learning capabilities. We sit on massive databases and massive data lakes. The fact that I understand how machine learning models work, or I can contribute to testing and evaluate them because I can write my own SQL queries, because maybe I've got like the data engineering side of our house that's full of what we would call backend or data engineers, but they don't know how to perhaps to like put a front end on it. So I can usually put a simple front end, and then that way I can help articulate to the rest of product leadership, here's what this would do for us. Here's a problem it can solve for us. Here are one of three ways this can show up and intersect with our products. And this part is hard. It's a part where I suffered when I was purely just a software engineer. There's that great book, Crossing the Chasm. And I think that happens inside of companies a lot, where you're a software engineer and you've found a good idea, but you don't know how to pitch it. You don't know how to sell it. You don't know how to find the attention that you need to find to get this idea adopted within the company, right? You might be thinking that you're sitting on gold, but if you don't know how to sell it right, it just will die. And so learning how to cross the chasm internally is tough. So it's a big part of what I do is helping managing emerging capabilities. And I will spend time and give ideas. I can bring that customer context into the experiments that are happening in the company. I can match that or marry that to, here's what we know about customer problems that are related to this right now. And this last blog post that I wrote, I was writing about the difference between capabilities, features, and outcomes. So most of our software engineers are really just thinking about capabilities. If you've been doing SaaS products for a while as a software engineer, you do start to think about maybe some features. I'm like, I can glue this and this and this workflow together, and that's a feature. Where product managers and product marketers need to come together is really emphasizing what are outcomes and really trying to make sure that we're leading with those, especially with our emerging capabilities. A capability is not a business. It's something that can enable an outcome. And a lot of times my job there is to understand, like, cool, we have this new capability. Most of the time we start with an outcome and then we figure out how to get there, right? We start with the what and the why, and then we work backwards to figure out the solution. But sometimes your capability comes first, your hammer comes first. And or sometimes you stumble upon a thing that a customer didn't know to ask for yet, right? I think Steve Jobs is widely credited with this kind of thing, where it's like, or I think there's also the Henry Ford quote, like, if I'd asked them what a customer wanted, they would have wanted a faster horse, or whatever the quote is, right? Right. That's the thing about managing emerging capabilities and technologies, is sometimes we're solving a problem that people didn't know they had yet, but they do want it. And so if a product manager can be evolved early in those phases, it's really important to prove that there's a need for this. It's really important to say, we have evidence that this either deepens our position within this existing customer segment, or we can create new customer segments. Is this a worthy thing to add to our portfolio? And if you wait very late in the life cycle, it's a very expensive thing to learn that there is no home for this capability. And that also results in software engineers being pretty dejected and pretty, it impacts morale, right? And so either your technical leadership bears the burden of managing software engineers who are exploring, which is a good thing. You want them to be curious and creative. But if that's not something that's innately part of how they think, then you'll have these frustrated software engineers curating really cool tech that doesn't have a home at your company. Technical product management is a place where I can bring a lot of the customer perspective in early and work with software engineers to shape that so that we cross the chasm successfully, that doesn't leave like burned out developers in this week.
So is it overly simplistic to just say that the more technical your product is, the more important it is to have a technical product manager running it? Or how would you even frame the advice to founders growing a company with regard to a more growth-oriented product manager versus a more technical-oriented product manager?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two answers to it. The first answer is kind of born out of, I have a lot of conversations with founders and early teams thinking about who should my first technical hire be,
Mm.
and what would describe them, and what are their passions. Um, so I think it's important that as you are growing a technical team at your company, um, your mix of generalists to specialists. I think we've framed, I think that the phrase T-shaped has emerged to describe different individual contributors and the breadth that they care about. But, as a CTO, I mean, CTOs aren't there to write code, and your technical leaders do write code, but that's not their most important function. So either you're growing this capability and this perspective in your technical leadership, or you are finding product managers who are technical that can kind of embed within the software team. And so I think that's really important for founders. Just really think of what kind of leadership and vision do I have in my software engineering group. It's either, in worst cases, I just got coders who don't care. Like, there's a joke where it's like, the worst thing about writing software is users, right? Like I just want to write code and it's beautiful, but I don't care who uses it. The
Right.
users are annoying. Like you don't want to build a team full of that. But like they exist, and there's great uses for software engineers who just care about the code. And then you can have software engineers who are empathetic to product leadership's vision. It's like, yep, I get what you're saying. I can figure out how to get you there. And then a step above would be your engineering leadership, like watching your blind spots, if you will. What's a better term than blind spot? Just basically having your back and saying, here's the thing that you asked for, but also here's the thing that you didn't ask for but should have asked for. So like if you can cultivate that within your software team, then you may not need a technical product manager. I can tell you though that hiring for that is hard. And it might be easier to look for product leadership that has some technical background that can partner with your technical leadership and steer things that way. So that's that first answer. And I think that could be like another whole other subject, is how to grow your engineering teams and what skills and perspectives to bring into it. I spent a lot of time thinking about that. But then the second answer is, is this meaningful if you have data products? I think so. Any team that's, I think being able to talk about your artificial intelligence or machine learning capabilities at your business, that's very popular right now. And there are a lot of tools that are making it easier and easier to manage. Who on your team is responsible for understanding if you're using machine learning ethically? Who on your team is responsible for understanding the biases that are introduced with the data sets that you're choosing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Who on your team is responsible for making sure that the software engineers are answering those questions? So being able to stay on pace with and having a technical acumen for what we're doing, again, like software, like I said earlier in our conversation, we can do amazing things and create and imagine and solve things in really incredible ways, but we can also, without realizing it, make pretty harmful mistakes. And it's like playing with fire and you don't know that fire can burn things. So it's funny when I talk with my son, he's 8, he's really terrified of knives, but I want to teach him to cook. And he's like, I'm going to cut myself. That knife is dangerous. I'm like, no, well, the knife is not dangerous because I've learned how to use it responsibly. The knife is not dangerous because I've trained and I know which parts of it are safe to touch. And, he's always amazed when I can touch the blade, but it's like, but I'm not rubbing the blade in the right way to make a cut. So this is safe. I can only say that because I've spent a lot of time learning those knives and learning how they work and how to use them safely. And also I know the ways that they can be used in an unsafe way. So too with software. Again, do you need an explicit technical product manager to see those kinds of things? Maybe not, but if it's not wrapped up in that explicit role, then you're either assuming or hoping that exists somewhere in your company, right? The thing about having it as a technical product manager role is that it's explicit rather than implicit. You're not wishing, you're knowing that you have that capability within your team.
Yeah. That's good. So let's take a modern example. I know that you were involved in our project recently, the public-private partnership with the state of Washington to help figure out how can we surface software to help Washingtonians get access to vaccine appointments near them in a way that would be equitable, accessible, etc. For those who are looking for that services. I know you played a key role in that. Do you want to maybe just tell the story, like how you dove into the chaos and kind of helped architect and execute some of the technical aspects of that?
Yeah, that project was super fun. In the beginning, I showed up mostly as a software engineer, right? In the early stages, I think it was already kind of clear what the problem to solve was. To back up, the context here was the state of Washington wants to help its citizens find locations to get a COVID vaccine. And, up until recently, we also had an eligibility problem. But I'm pretty excited that in a week or so, we won't have that problem as much. But anyway, the idea here was you live wherever you live in Washington State, and you do know that you want a vaccine. And if you are eligible, you want to find a vaccine that's close to you. And because supplies and allocations are what they are, you also want to find a place that's got appointments available, right? So that's the problem that we're trying to help Washingtonians solve is I want a vaccine. I want to find an appointment near me amidst a bunch of changing information. And I want to be able to know that I've secured an appointment, right? And that thing I said about the changing information is important, right? Because this is not necessarily like a product where it's always available or it doesn't cost us anything to reproduce. The availability of the product here in this case is very volatile. And so that's a big thing that we were really trying to help solve is making sure that the information is there and is current and correct so that Washingtonians can make good, well-informed decisions about their vaccine. So in the beginning, it was really just landing a bunch of developers from larger corporations, and me working through Proda. We've got a few of us that come from the product side, which is, like the startup side. We're very good and very used to saying, like, I understand what the problem is. Here's a couple different ways to solve it. Here's the fastest one to get to that. Hey, maybe before we solve that problem, we can break that problem down and solve this one sooner, right? Those are the kinds of things that in conversations we're able to bring in. The other thing that I think is really cool about having a lot of breadth of experience of ways to get things done is the thing I've just been so pleased with is it's kind of fun. It's like, hey, who has the strongest opinion about how to solve this problem? If there isn't a strong opinion, then like here are three options. We'll just pick one, right? We ended up going with Node, but it was just more like, hey, who has a strong opinion about databases? Someone raises their hand and is like, I like GraphQL. Like, any objections? No, let's go with that. The thing that's great about working with people who've been doing this for a while is the tech isn't the point. It's the path to the end, right? That's the point is just getting to the end and the smoothest path we can do. So a lot of where my role, now that the software is a bit more established, I get to step back a little bit and look at how do we understand if we're achieving the goals that we set out to achieve? How do we understand that the solution is doing its job? And how do we understand what's most important to do next? And so a lot of where my role happens now that I get to kind of reemerge as a product manager within there is really advising and consulting on, hey, what are the really important questions to ask of our solution? What are the really important questions to ask of the problems that Washingtonians want help with? And then working backwards and saying, great, what does our software do now? Where do we instrument the code to answer those questions? So I kind of own the product engagement stories, and getting to work with Walter quite a bit. And a lot of what we're doing is, we don't necessarily talk data when we talk to the state. We talk questions and curiosities and hypotheses, and we just say, like, what do you want to know? What do you want to be able to do? Which is that's a very big question. It's kind of like handing someone a blank sheet of paper, right? And that's intimidating. A lot of times what we can do is like, hey, would you like to get better at figuring out where vaccine deserts are? Would you like to get better at figuring out how we rebalance a surplus of vaccines to places and underrepresented communities that need them more? Mm-hmm. Would you like to try to understand from users' behavior where we need to do better marketing? Like, maybe the problem isn't access, the problem is marketing, or maybe the problem isn't supply here, but just equity or access, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
We try to spend some time with the state, asking them to imagine and think big like that. And because I've got a really intimate familiarity with the data that we have and the ways that we can capture that data, like I can start bringing us into questions that I know we can answer. And that's really, really rewarding and really satisfying is being very intimately involved with what I know the software can do and the stories it can tell us, and then making recommendations based on that, and then making next steps based on that. One of the things we just talked about yesterday would be how we could do closed loop data ecosystem. So that is to say, once they leave the VAX is the name for the project for the vaccine access. Once they leave the VAX website or the vaccine locator, we don't have any visibility in what they do next. But if we did know what they did next, what could we do now?
Mm.
And so that's where I can, again, the thing that product managers, whether you're technical or not, I think the thing we need to get good at is good curiosity and good questions. And since I'm not a product owner in this case, a lot of what I do is I just present a landscape of opportunities and ask them good questions to tease out what's valuable to them. And then I say, cool, like now that we know what's valuable to you and what's interesting to you, I already have 3 options prepared because I figured you would probably pick that. So here are 3 paths to do that. So that again, that's me transitioning from who, why, and what, and then transitioning into how, which
Yeah.
is something that I know I can do wrapped up in one role. Otherwise, I'd probably be turning to a tech lead, or maybe I'd bring a tech lead with me to a sales call, and they could rapidly talk about, here are 3 ways we can get this done. Good, fast, cheap. Pick 2. Which one do you want? That kind of thing. And in scenarios like this, I don't have to bring a second person along. I'm tightly embedded with the dev team, and it lets us move through these decisions much more quickly.
Yeah.
Because those kind of conversations are wrapped up and contained inside of myself, so I can kind of bring the tech lead along. So
Yeah.
hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Yeah. No, it
It's a
does.
really fun project to be a part of.
Yeah. And you mentioned Walter, but shout out to our colleague, Walter Thorn, because he has provided extremely valuable management leadership and leadership between the public-private partnership with the Department of Health at Washington State and with Starbucks and Microsoft and other companies involved. And in fact, even just thinking about him in particular, from the leadership that you interact with as a technical project manager, what do you see are helpful things for people that you report to or executives that you work with or managers that you work with, and what are things that you see are unhelpful in terms of how to even interact with a technical project manager?
Yeah, I've got a really good answer for both at Moz, how my manager helps me, and then also at with Walter inside of the VAX project, helping me understand the stakeholders are, who they care about, or what they care about, what they want to hear. A lot of the ways that I work on that is like, I'll just be sitting on all these ideas. And a habit that I've gotten into that works really well for me is just putting pitch decks together, right? Like at Moz, at any given time, I got between 3 and 5 active pitch decks that I'm developing.
Mm.
And I spend time with my manager just saying like, here's some capabilities, here's some pathways to productization that I see. Who am I selling this to, and what do they care about? How can I work this pitch in such a way that the way that I would pitch to my executive team is different than the way that I'd pitch to like developers and designers that I want to bring along, right? Like the vision casting that I'm doing for implementers is different than the vision casting I'm doing for executives and leaders. And it's the same with Walter, where it's like, hey, Walter, I see 4 or 5 different things that we could do here and that are all pretty cool. Who do I need to pitch this to get this going? Who do I need to find out? Like, I was reading in a book recently, like that one way that a lot of companies might make decisions is what's the acronym? Highest paid person in the room, right? And then there's decision by committee, and both of those are bad, right? And instead, what you want to be able to have is, who are my product thinkers, and who are my product leaders, and who are the people that are responsible for answering these questions correctly. I really like the RACI model: responsible, accountable, contributing, and informed. Right.
Mm.
A lot of times, what those people help me understand is who are the people that are accountable for this, and whose opinions matter.
Mm.
And they help me navigate the organization.
Yeah, yeah.
Managers are great for that. Things that are unhelpful. I haven't experienced one yet. I think part of my role comes with a little bit of like free range nature to it, which sounds really appealing, but it's also very intimidating sometimes.
Mm,
Where it's like, in a lot of roles, I know where the finish line is because it was told to me or it was given to me.
mm,
There's a lot of responsibility that comes with being. My job now is to say where the new finish line is, or that we're gonna detour, and here's why I think we should detour. So, I think when I'm not getting good feedback from my management or leadership about whether these new goalposts are in alignment with the strategic goals, um, it gives me good accountability. And so I think a thing that it would be devastating for a manager to do is not have that accountability, not help me put up some of these fence posts, and to let me walk off into a direction that they know is strategically not aligned.
mm.
Right.
Yep.
And there are times where, I am intended to introduce healthy disruption to our roadmap, positive disruption, the kinds of things that we didn't know we should have been pursuing when we formed our roadmap. Like we need to have some of that. But then there's a kind of a disruption that just isn't healthy. And so I need to come up for air every once in a while and just say like, hey, here are the new pitch decks I came up with. Which ones of these do you think we should pursue? If I'm not getting that, then that's an unhelpful thing.
So, last question: how are you thinking about the future? Like, what questions are you pursuing intellectually, professionally, personally yourself that are moving you in the next direction, maybe the next step in your career
Yeah.
progression?
Well, I can tell you that, the formal title of product manager is new for me. So I think a little bit right now in the near term is just understanding how that feels, as I'm wearing that title,
Mhm.
and understanding the ways that I can grow and really flex in this space. Other things that are new for me, I remember if you're a software engineer watching this and you want to kind of grow in this direction, a question that I found really useful to me to ask was when my managers asked me, hey, how can I help you? If you go down my path, the question that helped me was asking, help me learn how to grow in strategic influence. I already know tactical execution. I want to grow in strategic influence. And so I think I've achieved the new plane of strategic influence that I haven't had before. But, I'm influencing perhaps product lines or other product managers or lines of business within our product. I'm not yet at a point where I'm influencing like we should go in this strategic direction or adopt or drop this business. I'm not thinking in terms of business units yet. Um, Now there is, in the future, my relationship to startups and entrepreneurship. Like I, we've talked about this, you and I, but I've talked about what it was like to have kids and also being in a single income family. Like what I want to do to preserve like the way that I parent and the way that I'm a partner to my spouse, and finding career options that let me do pursue those family goals, right? And I intend, or at least I want my family goals to kind of supersede my career goals.
Mhm.
Which is why I'm not actively part of startups right now. And it's why things like the Proto relationship are actually really cool for me, is that in spare cycles that I have, I can still stay connected. I can still influence and involve. And, sometimes it feels like a second job, but it's really fulfilling. And to keep those relationships and those skills sharp. Someday, I can envision myself returning back to that. As an early founder, as a product leader, um, whether that would emerge as a CTO or as a head of product, it's hard to say. I think that the problems CTOs are responsible for answering aren't as interesting to me as they used to be.
Mm.
But even in asking them, right, like thinking about those questions, those are career questions. What kinds of problems do I want to solve, and at what level? So I think that kind of answers your question. Is just really understanding. I feel like if all of these are like step level growths, I've just emerged onto this step, and I'm figuring out, what the next step looks like. And the easiest and most general way to describe that is, what are the new kinds of problems I want to start tackling? What are the problems that I'm not good at yet? one of the things that's terrific about this is realizing a lot of the problems that I was solving I was already really good at. And it's like, I need to start taking on problems that cause me to grow because I'm not good at them yet. So I think that's what that looks like, is just getting comfortable with what I'm doing now and then going figure out what the next healthy discomfort place is to go find, and finding where those are aligned with, whatever company I'm working with at the time and what they need. But I think for me, it's going to be looking at solving bigger problems that are bigger than the ones I'm solving right now.
I know I said that was the last question, but one thing you said I am dying to follow up with is, what are the challenges and the responsibilities of the CTO now that you see that are less compelling to you as what a product manager does?
Sure, I think cost management is a big part of the CTO role. We could do another conversation someday about cost of ownership and cost of delivery. And I think PMs need to have some acumen of them. They need to be informed, to borrow from Racy, but they're not responsible for them the way that the engineering side of the house is and the way that the CTO are, right? I think, and this is a common place where engineering and product management can butt head, is what to do about technical debt and how it shows up in the roadmap. And product managers can introduce a lot of friction by not having like a working acumen of or a working knowledge of what cost of ownership are and what cost of delivery are, and like what for the product that you manage. Product managers are probably spending a lot of time thinking about engagement metrics and impact on revenue and impact on profit and so on. But if they're not thinking about the cost side, they're not truly able to manage their product or their features with a full set of information, right? So I think that's a big part of just kind of managing the technical investments, and it's interesting and it's important, but not as interesting to me as it was before. I think CTOs are a big part. If a CEO owns the culture at a startup or at any organization, the CTO does own like the technical culture. And there are subcultures, and those are just naturally emerge. But I spent a lot of time thinking about the technical subcultures, and I've often watched them drift from the rest of the business organization's culture. And so, when the tech team is feeling like, oh, hey, we're the real reason that this company runs, and like we're just going to do what we want because we're the only ones that get this, right? When things like that start to happen, your technical leadership really needs to make sure that that's not happening, and injecting the business perspective and injecting the customer empathy. And I really think the best way to do that is, the thing that makes everyone equals the most common plane is the customer perspective. And if you've got good technical leadership advocating for customer perspective and customer obsession, to borrow from another Seattle large company, that customer obsession really kind of puts everyone on an equal playing field. It's like, it's not teams competing against each other. It's teams standing shoulder to shoulder or side by side working on behalf of a customer. So, I think it's just balance sheet stuff that I'm just not as excited about.
Cool. Well, David, this has been amazing. Where can people find you online if they're interested to continue the conversation with you?
Sure. So my personal website is thedahv.com, THEDAHV. And that's where I write about tech and product management and things like that. But my handle pretty much everywhere else is also the Dahv, THEDAHV. On Twitter, I mostly tweet about product management or tech, but it's going to be just like a bunch of stuff about my kids and dumb jokes that I think are funny. But that's where I spend a lot of time on Twitter. It's mostly about that. And you'll also probably see me, if you want to learn a little bit more about SEO, I tweet about that there too. And then the rest is not as interesting. Instagram is just going to be me being done with my kids.
That's great. Well, David, the Dahv, this has been amazing. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting me, and hopefully we get to do more of these.
Indeed. All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups and health science and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number 2, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you in your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it would be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.